The city was asleep. It was 17 inches the morning, on the 6th of October, 1948. In the Soviet Republic of Turkmenistan, the capital city of Ashgabat lay quiet beneath a warm desert sky. The bazaars had long closed. The streets that had hummed with the voices of Turkmen, Russian, and Armenian families were empty. Somewhere, a dog barked. A child turned in their sleep. A night shift worker at the cotton mill glanced at a clock on the wall. He would never see that clock again. What happened in the next 57 seconds would kill somewhere between 110,000 and 176,000 human beings. The exact number would be disputed, concealed, and deliberately erased for the better part of 4 decades. What happened in those 57 seconds would reduce a living, breathing capital city to a field of dust and broken brick. And what happened afterward, in the halls of Moscow, in the offices of party officials, in the deliberate silence imposed by one of the most powerful governments in human history, would constitute a second catastrophe, quieter, colder, and in many ways more calculated than the earthquake itself. This is the story of the Ashgabat Earthquake of 1948. This is the story of 57 seconds that erased a city. And this is the story of the decades that followed, in which a government decided that the dead were an inconvenience, that grief was a political liability, and that silence was the most efficient tool of control ever devised. Ashgabat in 1948 was not a glamorous city. It sat at the edge of the Karakum Desert, pressed against the foothills of the Kopet Dagh mountain range, which forms the natural border between what was then Soviet Turkmenistan and Iran. The city had been a modest Russian garrison town in the 19th century, a place the Tsarist Empire had seized from the Teka Turkmen in 1881. After the Bolshevik Revolution, it became the administrative center of the Turkmen Soviet Socialist Republic, a city of government buildings, cotton processing plants, a state university, and rows upon rows of single-story mud brick and adobe homes that stretched outward from the center in every direction. The population in 1948 was estimated at around 170,000 people. They lived in a city that had been built, largely, from the earth beneath their feet. Mud brick, compressed clay, adobe walls that had stood for generations, sturdy enough against the desert heat, adequate enough against the mild tremors that occasionally rumbled through the Kopet Dagh fault system. The geology of southern Turkmenistan had always been restless. The region sat atop a collision zone between tectonic plates, and earthquakes were not unknown. But the people had lived with that tension for so long that it had become background noise. A tremor here, a rattle of windows there. Nothing had prepared them for what the earth held in reserve. At 1:17 a.m. local time, a rupture initiated along a fault line running roughly parallel to the Kopet Dagh range, approximately 25 kilometers southwest of the city center. The United States Geological Survey would later assign the event a magnitude of 7.3. Soviet seismological records, when they were eventually made available, corroborated a figure in that range, though the exact measurement, like nearly everything else about this disaster, became entangled in politics. A magnitude 7.3 earthquake releases energy roughly equivalent to the detonation of nearly 400 nuclear weapons of the size dropped on Hiroshima. That energy, compressed into the bedrock, travels outward as seismic waves, P waves that push and pull the ground horizontally, and S waves that roll and heave it vertically. When those waves reached Ashgabat's shallow alluvial soil loose, water-saturated sediment deposited over millennia by rivers from the mountains they amplified. The ground did not simply shake, it convulsed. The mud brick homes of Ashgabat, the dominant building type in a city where most residents lived, were structurally incapable of surviving what was coming. Adobe construction, for all its thermal efficiency, has one catastrophic vulnerability. It has almost no tensile strength. When the ground moves laterally, the walls of an adobe structure cannot flex. They do not bend. They do not sway. They simply fail. They crack, buckle outward, and collapse inward, bringing the roof directly down onto whoever is sleeping beneath it. At 1:17 a.m., almost every person in Ashgabat was sleeping beneath such a roof. The shaking lasted 57 seconds, according to Soviet seismological records. 57 seconds of the ground moving in ways that defied any ordinary human comprehension, not the brief, sharp jolt that most people associate with earthquakes, but a sustained, rolling, grinding convulsion that went on and on and on, long past the point where a person's mind could process what was happening, long past the point where running would have helped, long past the point of anything at all. When it stopped, the city of Ashgabat no longer existed in any recognizable form. Witnesses who survived, and there were not many who survived uninjured, described emerging from the wreckage into a sky thick with dust, so dense it blocked out the stars. The air tasted of pulverized clay and something metallic. The silence was not a peaceful silence. It was the silence of a city that had, in less than a minute, stopped producing sound. No traffic, no machinery, no voices calling out from lit windows. The power grid had collapsed within the first seconds of the quake. The water mains had ruptured. The roads, such as they were, had cracked and buckled, and in some places simply vanished beneath shifted earth. And everywhere, in every direction where buildings had stood, there were now only low, irregular mounds of rubble. The government buildings in the city center, constructed from brick and reinforced to a slightly higher standard than the residential neighborhoods, fared marginally better. But marginally means very little when the standard is near total collapse. The State Opera House, the government headquarters, the university, all structurally compromised or destroyed. The cotton processing plants, whose thick brick walls had seemed so permanent, folded along their foundations. The railway station, which connected Ashgabat to the broader Soviet rail network and which would become critical in the days that followed, survived with damage but remained operational. That detail would matter enormously for what came next. But in the residential neighborhoods to the north, south, and east of the city center, survival rates were devastating in their rarity. In some blocks, no one survived. In others, a handful of people dragged themselves out of the ruins into the dust-choked, dark, disoriented, many of them injured, many of them calling names that would not be answered again. Among the survivors of that first night was a young boy named Sapar Murat Niyazov. He was 8 years old. His father had died in the Second World War 2 years earlier. Now, in the rubble of the family home, he lost his mother and 2 brothers. The boy who survived that night in the ruins of Ashgabat would go on to become the president and eventually the supreme dictator of independent Turkmenistan, ruling the country from 1990 until his death in 2006. He would rename months of the year after himself and his mother. He would build a gold-plated statue of himself in the capital that rotated to always face the sun. But in October 1948, he was just a child standing in the dust. The earthquake killed, by the most widely cited estimates, approximately 110,000 people. Some Soviet-era documents, declassified decades later, suggest figures ranging as high as 176,000. The discrepancy matters. It matters because it reflects not just uncertainty, but deliberate obfuscation. The Soviet government, operating under the direct authority of Joseph Stalin, made a decision in the hours and days following the earthquake that would define everything that came after. They decided to control the story. And in 1948, in the Soviet Union, controlling a story meant one thing: silence. The first problem was information. In the immediate aftermath of the quake, the communications infrastructure of Ashgabat, already limited by 1948 standards, had been completely severed. Telephone lines were down. The telegraph office had collapsed. The radio transmission tower, which might have broadcast news of the disaster to the outside world, was damaged and without power. For the first several hours, Ashgabat was, in the most literal sense, cut off. The second problem was the outside world. The Kopet Dag fault zone runs along the border with Iran. Iranian seismological stations registered the earthquake almost immediately. The tremor was felt across the border. Foreign journalists based in Tehran were already filing preliminary reports about a major earthquake somewhere in Soviet Central Asia before the sun rose on October 6th. The story was already beginning to leak at its edges. like water pressing against a dam. Moscow knew this. The Soviet response was swift, coordinated, and two-tracked. The first track was practical: relief operations. Military units and NKVD personnel, the Soviet secret police, were mobilized and dispatched to Ashgabat. Trains began moving southward on the rail lines, carrying personnel, heavy equipment, and supplies. This part of the response was genuine. The Soviet state was quite capable of massive, rapid mobilization when its interests demanded it. But the second track was the one that would define the historical legacy of the Ashgabat earthquake. Even as relief trains moved toward the ruined city, orders moved in the opposite direction. Information moving out of Ashgabat was to be suppressed. Journalists were prohibited from entering the disaster zone. Local party officials were instructed on what could and could not be communicated. The death toll, the true death toll, was classified, and in the official Soviet press, the earthquake was acknowledged in terms so minimal, so sanitized, so stripped of human scale, that they constituted not reporting but erasure. Pravda, the official Soviet newspaper, the same newspaper that could devote pages to grain production quotas and congratulatory telegrams to Stalin, published a notice of the Ashgabat earthquake that occupied less space than a standard weather report. There were no photographs, no survivor accounts, no description of the scale of the destruction. The notice confirmed that an earthquake had occurred, that the government was responding, and that the socialist state was tending to its people. And then, the story was over. The true scale, a city essentially wiped from the map, a death toll representing 2/3 of the entire urban population, was placed in a sealed file in Moscow and would not emerge into public discourse for nearly 4 decades. The reasons were multiple and interlocking, the way all Soviet calculations were. Stalin's cult of personality was at its absolute peak in 1948. The great leader could not be associated with catastrophe. Catastrophe implied vulnerability. Vulnerability implied weakness. And weakness, in the architecture of Stalinist ideology, was not merely a political liability, it was a form of ideological contamination. The Soviet Union had just won the most devastating war in human history. It had defeated Nazi Germany. It had emerged as one of 2 global superpowers. The image of a Soviet city reduced to rubble, not by a human enemy, but by the ground itself, by the indifferent physics of tectonic plates, was simply incompatible with the narrative that the party required. There was also a more immediate, more brutal calculus. The Soviet Union in 1948 was engaged in the opening maneuvers of the Cold War. The Berlin blockade had begun that same year. Relations with the West were at their most hostile since the end of the war. Stalin was not going to allow a humanitarian crisis on Soviet soil to become a propaganda weapon in foreign hands. He was not going to allow journalists, aid organizations, or foreign governments anywhere near Ashgabat. And he was certainly not going to admit, to his own people or to anyone else, that tens of thousands of Soviet citizens had died in their sleep because their government had built their city out of mud. And so the silence descended. For the survivors in Ashgabat, this silence was its own form of violence. The relief operation, when it arrived, was large. Soviet military units worked alongside civilian workers to clear rubble and recover bodies. The scale of the task was staggering in the worst affected neighborhoods. There was no building left standing, only a continuous field of compacted debris that had to be shifted by hand, by shovel, by any means available. The bodies of the dead were buried in mass graves, quickly and without ceremony, because the October heat in Turkmenistan was not forgiving, and the public health implications of 100,000 unburied dead were something even the most ideologically rigid party official could not ignore. Survivors were, in many cases, relocated. Families were broken apart and dispersed to other Soviet republics, a process that carried the flavor, to those who experienced it, of the deportations that Stalin had already inflicted on dozens of ethnic groups across the USSR. Many survivors lost not just their homes and their families in the earthquake, but their communities, their neighborhoods, their anchors to place and identity in the chaotic months that followed, and they were forbidden to speak of what had happened. Not explicitly. In most cases, there was no formal decree that survivors could point to, but the culture of silence was enforced through the ordinary mechanisms of Soviet control. The knowledge that speaking of the disaster meant speaking of the scale of Soviet failure, and that speaking of Soviet failure had consequences. Careers ended. Freedoms were curtailed. In 1948, in Stalin's Soviet Union, a person did not need to be told explicitly not to speak. They already knew. The city was rebuilt. Slowly, and with the characteristic Soviet emphasis on function over sentiment, Ashgabat was reconstructed: wider streets, more modern buildings, a cleaner grid. But the rebuilding was also an act of erasure. The new city bore little physical resemblance to what had stood before, and the absence of public memorials, the absence of official acknowledgement, the absence of any public space where the magnitude of the loss could be named and mourned, meant that the grief had nowhere to go. It compressed, it calcified. It was passed from parents to children in whispered fragments, in the careful language of those who had learned that certain truths were spoken only in private, only in the family, only with the lights low, and the windows closed. The Ashgabat earthquake killed approximately 2/3 of the city's population in 57 seconds. To understand what that means at a human level, consider the Black Death in 14th century Europe, the most catastrophic epidemic in recorded Western history, killed roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of the affected population over several years. The Ashgabat earthquake achieved a comparable proportional death toll in under a minute. Among the dead were virtually the entire medical staff of the city's main hospital, which collapsed completely. Among the dead were teachers, engineers, musicians, the social infrastructure of a city, its institutional memory, its human capital, gone in a single pulse of the earth. Among the dead were an estimated 25,000 children. In the rubble of the main government building, rescue workers found the body of the first secretary of the Turkmen Communist Party, Suhan Babayev, who had been working late into the night. They also found, buried in the collapsed archive rooms, thousands of documents, files, records, the administrative paperwork of a Soviet republic, many of them irrecoverable. The earthquake had, quite literally, destroyed the records of the society it had destroyed. And in the ruins of a residential block near the market district, rescue workers reported finding, according to a survivor account later collected by a Turkmen oral historian, a radio still playing. The station it had been tuned to a Moscow broadcast was transmitting music, a cheerful Soviet march, into a room where the walls had fallen inward and no one was left to hear it. The broadcast continued for some time before the battery finally died. By December 1948, the official Soviet position was settled. The earthquake had occurred. The government had responded heroically. The reconstruction was proceeding. The Soviet people had shown their resilience and their unity under the wise leadership of Comrade Stalin. There was nothing more to be said. The true death toll remained classified. It would remain classified for 38 years. It was not until 1988, under Mikhail Gorbachev's policy of glasnost, or openness, that the Soviet government officially acknowledged the full scale of the Ashgabat earthquake. For the first time, the official death toll was publicly revised upward toward figures that bore some relationship to reality. For the first time, the event was discussed openly in the Soviet press, not as a footnote, but as a catastrophe, one of the deadliest earthquakes of the 20th century, a disaster that had been hidden from the world and, more devastatingly, hidden from the Soviet people themselves. In 1988, 40 years after the earthquake, the survivors were old. Many of them had spent their entire adult lives carrying a grief that their own government had told them did not exist at a sufficient scale to be mourned publicly. Many of them had lost everyone, and many of them, upon hearing the official acknowledgement, felt not relief, but a cold and particular kind of fury, the fury of those who have been told, for decades, that what they saw with their own eyes was not significant enough to record. One survivor, whose account was published in a Soviet literary journal in 1988 following the Glasnost-era disclosures, described waking in the rubble as a teenager to find both her parents dead beside her. She described walking through the ruins of her neighborhood for hours before finding another living person. She described the relief workers arriving, the efficiency with which the dead were removed, the speed with which everything was made orderly again. and she described being told by a party official who came to register her as a surviving dependent that she should not discuss what she had seen with anyone outside the designated relief channels. She was 15 years old. She said she understood, even then, that the silence was not for her benefit. The geological lessons of Ashgabat were, eventually, incorporated into Soviet and later international building codes. The catastrophic vulnerability of unreinforced adobe and mud brick construction to lateral seismic forces became a case study in earthquake engineering. Though this incorporation was slow, and the knowledge arrived far too late for the 170,000 people who had called that city home in October 1948. The fault zone beneath the Kopet Dag Range remains active. The seismological risk to the region, now the capital of independent Turkmenistan, a city that has grown to nearly 1.1 million people, is ongoing and well documented. Modern Ashgabat is a city of marble and white stone, rebuilt and rebuilt again, a city of grand monuments and authoritarian architecture, a city that has been made to look, from certain angles, as though it has always been new, as though nothing was ever lost. But the earth beneath it has not changed. The fault is still there. The tension is still there. The accumulated stress along the Kopet Dag system continues to build, as it has always built, as it always will build, until the moment it finds release. And when that moment comes, and seismologists are clear that such a moment will come, though not when the city that stands above that fault will be measured against the choices made in every year since 1948. The quality of the buildings, the integrity of the warning systems, the speed of emergency response, the honesty of the government with its people about the nature of the risk they live above. In 1948, a city was erased in 57 seconds. But the conditions for that erasure, the building methods, the absence of seismic standards, the isolation of a population from accurate information about its own risk, were not created in 57 seconds. They were created over years, over decades, through choices made by institutions and individuals who had every opportunity to understand what they were doing and every political incentive to do nothing about it. The earthquake was a force of nature. The death toll was, to a measurable and significant degree, a force of policy. And the silence, the 38 years of state-enforced silence that denied an entire people the right to mourn, to count, to name their dead publicly, to process a catastrophe that had taken 2/3 of their city in under a minute, the silence was entirely a choice, made deliberately, maintained deliberately, by human beings, in offices, with telephones and printing presses, and the full coercive machinery of one of the most powerful states in history at their disposal. The survivors lived with that silence. They outlived Stalin, who died in 1953, 5 years after the earthquake. They outlived the Cold War. They lived to see the Soviet Union dissolve in 1991, to see Turkmenistan become an independent nation, to see Ashgabat rebuilt in white marble under the rule of the boy who had survived the rubble as an 8-year-old orphan. Many of them never heard a single official word of acknowledgement spoken in their direction while they could still fully comprehend it. The dead were never individually counted. Their names were never, in any comprehensive official sense, recorded and preserved. There is no complete memorial. There is no wall with 110,000 names. There is a monument in modern Ashgabat, the Earthquake Monument, constructed after independence, featuring a bull atop a 3-legged pedestal, holding the globe on its back, with a crack in the globe representing the fault, a structure that is, like so much of what was built in Turkmenistan under its post-Soviet rulers, more concerned with symbolism than with the actual human beings it nominally honors. The earthquake lasted 57 seconds. The erasure lasted 38 years. And the question that this city, this fault line, and this history pose to every subsequent generation is not a comfortable one. It is not a question about the power of nature. Nature does what nature does. The question is about the power of information and the price of its suppression, whether the systematic withholding of truth from the people most directly affected by a catastrophe constitutes its own form of catastrophe, whether the dead deserve to be counted, whether the living deserve to know how many were lost and why. In 1948, a government decided the answer to those questions was no. In 1988, 40 years later, the world learned differently. But the people of Ashgabat, the survivors, the orphans, the children who grew up in a city whose wound had no name they had always known, they had known from the moment the dust settled and the silence began. From the moment it became clear that the world intended to move on, and that they were expected to move with it, carrying what they had lost in the dark, privately, without ceremony, without record, and without end. The city of Ashgabat stands today. It stands on the same ground, above the same fault. In 57 seconds in 1948, the Earth reminded an entire civilization of its most fundamental vulnerability. The question is whether the record of that reminder survives long enough to matter, or whether silence, as it has before, wins again.